Hello, I'm Shaun Fitzgerald from the Centre for Climate Repair, and I'm joined today by Justus and Ellen from Operaatio Arktis. We're at COP29 and having some reflections about the discussions so far, and in particular the events that have unfolded during the course of the last few days. So Justus and Ellen, we've seen a number of discussions, and in particular yesterday I was in one of the plenaries listening to the climate champions and about the real need for action now because of the indigenous people who are being really on the front line of climate change. So I wanted to ask you first, comparing this COP with last COP, about sort of the various actions that are being considered. We've talked about Article 6 and therefore that being a helpful progression in terms of therefore there perhaps being a mechanism to have a carbon market which greenhouse gas removal might feature. But we're a long way from where we need to be. What are your thoughts, first of all, on the progress on Article 6 so far?
Well, I think it's still early, but it doesn't seem very hopeful to me. It seems that there's a huge lack of ambition there, and groups seem to be a bit divided still. So I'm not really hopeful at this point, but there's a second week still coming up, so I don't know.
What about you, Justus?
Well, I'm not really hopeful either. I think it's also a sign that we are missing lots of big world leaders as well, like that they haven't come to this COP this year. For example, von der Leyen, she's not here. Macron is not here. Xi is not here from China. There is no U.S. president here either. So it seems that we are kind of lagging behind in this COP as well in this regard, and it's a pity.
So if the signals are that there's too little action regarding actually tackling climate change, and as Guterres has said this week, 2024 has been a masterclass in the disasters for climate change. What are the sorts of things that we should be talking about then? And I'm thinking of climate engineering. Is that being talked about in this COP, and how did that compare with perhaps the last two COPs where you've been involved?
Well, actually, this is the first COP for me, so I cannot really compare to the COPs before, but there has been some discussions this COP. I actually moderated the session yesterday on youth engagement on this discussion, but I would characterize this discussion that we are speaking about more on the ethics and governance and general side of things, that how do we even have this discussion and so forth. But you have been to COPs before, so maybe, I don't know if you have some...
Well, I think those kind of discussions are very important, where we emphasize the participation and the need to include more voices in the discussion. But then again, thinking about the timeline when we would need these sort of interventions or climate engineering pathways, like you said, I think we should also be really seriously looking into different kinds of methods and how would they fit into a sustainable decarbonization pathway. So there is some talk about also CDR, carbon dioxide removal, ways, also in the bigger rooms and negotiations. But I fear that these are kind of staying in a sort of bubble where we don't take them seriously. For example, the civil society side should be engaged also in those discussions, and we should start to look at how can we make this a comprehensive, sustainable whole, like a climate response strategy that would actually have a chance to keep us under the 1.5 target, which is like a serious limit of more climate impacts coming in. So that is what I would like to see also in the bigger rooms.
Right. So, I mean, I had the pleasure of going to one event on Monday evening, which was more on the ethics and governance side, of course. But, what I'm seeing is that there's an absence of basically in-depth discussions on any particular approach, whereas actually Operaatio Arktis were really instrumental in being involved in one of those events last year. At COP28 in Dubai. It was on seabed curtains, but it provided a forum for actually an education setting, but also some really deep discussions about whose voices should be there about the need for research. And in particular, there was a lady called Ilana Said. She was the United Nations ambassador for the islands of Palau. And she said, it's really important that we explore options, frankly, to stop sea level rise, because 2 meters of sea level rise isn't a case of losing a bit of beach for her people. There is no country left after this. And therefore she was saying, our people are desperate for this research. But I haven't heard anything about sort of that sort of strength of feeling for furtherance of knowledge in the COP thus far. Have you?
Well, maybe some. For example, as part of the Monday's discussion that you were referring to, there was, for example, Professor Nanama Brown Clutch, who is doing a great effort with her research team in Ghana, studying the effects and impacts of stratospheric aerosol injection, one climate intervention method, but also maybe the discussion was not focused on that so much.
Right.
So this is something that I think we should be discussing more about, and also in that same kind of setting where we have the thinking about what are the climate vulnerabilities at stake and which groups are most impacted by climate risks, and then potential new risks, benefits, or risk reductions that come into play when we think about climate interventions, and then work with those groups, thinking about the research, designing it, conducting it, interpreting results, and then sort of from that think about where we can move forward.
So what would your hopes be thinking about next week, so the rest of COP29, and then looking further ahead to COP30 and future COPs? What would you like to be discussed more in those fora?
I would actually like to see, as you said, more evaluation of the techniques themselves, having sessions on these special techniques and actually exploring them. Because now I feel like, especially here, it's now a lot of making even the case that even if we should be speaking about these things, so you can kind of see that there has been maybe a step back. So maybe with this COP we can take a step forward, or maybe 2 steps forward, in a way that we can maybe move from the discussion, if we should even speak about these things, to go in a position where we can actually start to explore and evaluate these things.
Okay.
But I would like to add that I think this COP can be still quite helpful in actually speaking of the ethics and the governance. So I think we can make actually good progress in those things as well, and that can create a really good base for the future discussions on the actual evaluation and exploring these different pathways.
Yeah, I agree with that. For example, there is today one event by the AGU on their new ethical framework for climate intervention research. But what I would really like to see is how we implement those principles that are on very neutral. They're not targeted for any specific research or any specific policy making. So we should really start to look at how can we use those with specific climate intervention methods, and that is what I would like to see to be discussed more. How does the actual research look like? What is the method, and what are the different dimensions of it? And we should go a lot deeper into that discussion, because what I would also like to see is that we really face where we are standing with the state of climate. We're still talking about how we need to stay below 1.5 or need to stay below 2 degrees, but then the UN Environment Programme's recent emission cap report is showing us that we're now going towards 2.9 degrees of extra global warming, and we're just not looking into the actual what it would actually take for us to stay within safer temperature rise limits.
Well, I think that's a really important sort of way to be thinking about this, as to what will it take to keep below what we think is probably a safe temperature limit. And I really hope that your hopes for COP30, where we can discuss these things more, are become a reality. So thanks ever so much indeed for joining us. Until next time.